Our scripture this morning is taken from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 11, verses 16 through 19, and then 25 through 30. And as you listen to the reading of the Gospel, I would ask you to focus on John the Baptist and Jesus and their two very different approaches to ministry.
To what will I compare this generation? It is like a child sitting in the marketplaces, calling out to others. We played the flute for you, and you didn't dance. We sang a funeral song, and you didn't mourn. For John came neither eating nor drinking, and they say he has a demon. Yet the human one came eating and drinking, and they say, look, a glutton and a drunk, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. But wisdom is proved to be right by her works. At that time, Jesus said, I praise you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because you've hidden these things from the wise and intelligent and have shown them to your babies. Indeed, Father, this brings you happiness. My Father has handed all things over to me. No one knows the Son except the Father, and nobody knows the Father except the Son and anyone to whom the Son wants to reveal him. Come to me, all you who are struggling hard and carrying heavy loads, and I will give you rest. Put on my yoke and learn from me. I'm gentle and humble, and you will find rest for yourselves. My yoke is easy to bear, and my burden is light.
My son Aaron is 19 years old. When he was 14 years old, he started developing some very strong opinions on music. What is good music? What isn't good music? What are good bands? What aren't good bands? He had some friends who were learning to play the guitar, and he thought that would be a great thing to do. He got really insistent about it, and I told him, if you want to learn to play the guitar, we'll need to get you lessons. We'll need to invest in a guitar. I said, and you're going to have to promise to practice regularly. And he was sincere about it. He really wanted to do this. So I said, fine. I located guitar lessons for him at a music store. It was going to be once a week for an hour. And I told him we could go and pick out a guitar. He was so excited. We got to the music store. We walked in the door. And of course, they had all different kinds of instruments. But along the back wall, they had every kind of guitar I'd ever seen. We walked in, I started heading straight in, and I noticed my son was no longer with me. He'd gone off this direction. Well, I was heading for the acoustic guitars, and he was heading for the electric guitars. I thought, oh, well, I'm a mom, so I nipped that in the bud. I said, come on over here. It's going to be an acoustic guitar. You've got to learn on that, and if you are serious and if you practice, we'll get you an electric guitar. So that was fine with him. They helped us pick out an acoustic guitar that was appropriate for him. They tuned it. We got him a case. We took it home. His lessons were going to start in a couple days. He was noodling around on that guitar almost the whole time. I could hardly get it out of his hands. He went for his first lesson. I dropped him off. Came back an hour later. I said, so how'd it go? Oh, it was okay. I said, well, what did you do? Well, he taught me how to hold my guitar, how to tune my guitar, how to hold my fingers when I'm going to play chords. He taught me about 3 chords that I'm supposed to practice, and I said, well, that's great. I said, did he give you any music or anything to practice on? He said, yeah. And he pulled out a sheet, and it was Mary Had a Little Lamb. Not exactly rock and roll. And I told him, any music lesson I've ever taken started out that way. You've got to learn the basics. And for some reason, nursery rhyme tunes seem to be the thing you have to play in the beginning. I said, don't worry. You keep going to your lessons, you keep working hard, you keep practicing. He'll give you better music. So a couple weeks went by. A couple more weeks went by. We had moved up to Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star and Go Tell Aunt Rhody. And he was getting frustrated, very, very frustrated. My son's objective, his vision, was to learn to play the guitar. And he entered into these lessons with genuine curiosity, interest, and desire, and a willingness to work hard. But this approach to learning was so rigid, so highly structured, and dull, and boring, that it was absolutely burdensome to him. And his original curiosity and interest and desire just seemed to drain away under the weight. Pretty soon, he really had no desire to practice, no desire to go back to these lessons. And I thought about my own guitar lessons that I took when I was 14 and 15, and I realized something. My son and I are wired an awful lot alike in a lot of ways, but there are some ways that we are not. When I was 14 years old, my lessons started out the very same way. I was taking from a woman who taught from her home. She taught me how to hold my guitar, how to tune my guitar. She taught me those 3 chords that'll get you through nearly any song. And I was playing things like nursery rhyme tunes. And I remember, you know what? It was boring. And really, it didn't get better fast. And what I recognized was that at 14, 15 years old, I was a rule follower. Absolutely. If an adult was in a position of authority, and frankly, you only had to be an adult in my eyes to be in a position of authority, but if you were something like a teacher, I wouldn't question. And if guitar lessons were boring, well, I guess that's how they were supposed to be. But my son is different. He's not belligerent, and he didn't question the guitar teacher, but he questioned me. What he knew was this: these lessons he was taking were so dull, so burdensomely boring. And music is not boring. Music is exciting. He loved music. It was music that made him want to learn to play the guitar in the first place, and he could not make the connect. It didn't make sense. And I started thinking, well, he's got a point. Why shouldn't the process be intriguing? Why shouldn't it be exciting? Why shouldn't it be fun? I mean, yes, it requires effort and a willingness to practice, but the willingness to make an effort was not a problem. And I thought, there just has to be a better approach. Well, at this time in this church, there was a young man working here by the name of Dan Sabella. Many of you knew Dan. He has since moved on. He's at another place. He and his wife have had a baby. They're doing just great. But at this time, Dan worked here, and he started out as a custodian and then moved into the maintenance area of the church. He was a really excellent employee. He was an absolutely delightful young man. He was the epitome of cool. And I knew that he was working here to pay the bills and for the benefits, but his real passion was music. He had a band. So he would work here during the day and play gigs with his band at night. And I knew from people who know that he was really good, really good. So I thought, So I caught up with Dan, and I asked him, have you ever taught guitar to anyone? He said, no, I haven't. And I told him why I was asking. He said, well, let me think about it, and I'll get back to you. A couple days later, he got back to me. He said, okay, I will do this. I will try and teach Aaron guitar. He said, but one thing I want you to have him do for me before we ever meet the first time is I want him to take a piece of paper and write down his favorite bands and his favorite songs and bring it to that very first session. I said, okay. So it wasn't very much later that the two of them were meeting for their first session, and Aaron did bring that sheet of paper. And they started out, Dan needed to know what Aaron already knew. Well, Aaron knew how to hold his guitar and tune his guitar, and he knew a number of chords. He showed Dan all of that, and they spent the rest of the time talking about music, talking about Aaron's bands and list of songs that he liked. And Dan shared the kind of music that he likes, and some of it crossed over. And Dan had brought some music that they could play together. And by the very next session, Dan had brought music that they could use at that session and Aaron could take home for practice that came from Aaron's list of favorite songs. And what they would do is Aaron would bring his acoustic guitar and Dan would bring his electric guitar. Aaron would play the chords and Dan would play everything else, and they would jam. and it was a whole different experience by lesson 2. My son wanted to learn to play the guitar. He learned to play with joy. Now, depending on your age and your experience with music and your background, some of us in here are probably thinking, my goodness, Dan's way of teaching is certainly unorthodox, and that there are rules and basics that must be mastered before we play any real music. And then we would probably have to have a discussion about what is real music, because if you feel that way, probably none of what Aaron was learning was real music. But then there's probably some of us in here who are thinking, wow, I wish someone had taught me how to play guitar or piano or flute or cello like that when I was a kid. I might still be playing. So is one of these ways right and one wrong? No, absolutely not. These are just 2 very different approaches. One is strict and standard and purposefully inflexible, and the other is unconventional and risk-taking and compassionate, in that it met my son where he was at that time in his life, and it reached him and it worked. He has an acoustic guitar, 2 electric guitars. They're sitting out in his room. His vision was to learn to play the guitar, and he learned. Now, it did not become his vocation, and I don't mind telling you that's fine with me. But he can pick up those guitars and noodle around like nobody's business. So in our scripture today, we're looking at John the Baptist and Jesus, and their 2 very different approaches in ministry. Our scripture reads, John came eating no bread and drinking no wine, and you say he has a demon. Well, we know that John the Baptist is a very important character in Scripture. He was a prophet, and he prepared the way for Jesus' ministry. And he had plenty of disciples, those that would come gather around the river to hear him preach and teach and be baptized. But you have to know that for all of those that gathered around the river to hear him, plenty didn't. And it may have been because of his very fire and brimstone way of preaching. It may have been because he had a tendency to call people a brood of snakes and focus on sins. It may have been that they just didn't feel welcome. And then our scripture goes on, Jesus came eating and drinking, and they say, look, a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. The invitation that Jesus offered to people then and offers to us now is very different from the rigid and strict asceticism of John the Baptist. But we know there were those then and there are those now who reject Jesus and what I would call his life-affirming approach, because frankly, for so many people, it is too unconventional. It is too risky. And it's too compassionate, because he would sit and eat with anyone. There are biblical scholars that compare the approach of John the Baptist and Jesus to a funeral and a wedding, or to a dirge and a dance. And then finally, Jesus says, come to me, all you who are struggling hard and carrying heavy loads, and I will give you rest. Put on my yoke and learn from me. I'm gentle and humble, and you will find rest for yourselves. My yoke is easy to bear, and my burden light. Jesus' approach is absolutely unconventional, risk-taking, and compassionate. Jesus meets people where they are. Jesus meets us where we are. It doesn't matter our age. It doesn't matter where we are in our faith journey. And as disciples of Jesus Christ, given the choice of the burdensome approach of John the Baptist or the life-affirming approach of Jesus, most of us prefer Jesus' approach. And in the United Methodist Church, this is who we are meant to be. We are meant to be a church of grace. But something interesting happens once we're in. If you become a regular attender or a member or part of a ministry or an ongoing class, if you become regularly involved and at ease and start to feel good about your place in the church, that's great. But at that point, it is so easy and so natural to start to become set in your ways. And I mean like cement, inflexible. Whatever brought you into the church, whatever is most meaningful for you here, you never want it to change. And when that happens, we start to resemble more and more, not only John the Baptist and his rigidity, but maybe even worse, those music store guitar lessons. We become too structured, too dull, too boring, and that is just, for many, much too burdensome. We cannot afford to be that church. At Manchester United Methodist Church, we have been talking about next generation ministry. Next generation is defined as 18 to 26-year-olds, and this is an absolutely critical group. And the need is mutual. The church not only needs them, but they need us. You know they do. And we have got to learn how to connect through unconventional, risk-taking, compassionate methods. We have got to meet these young adults where they are. We have two relatively new staff members, Elizabeth Coker-Brandt and Winter DeGraff Hamilton. They are in charge of young adult ministry. My daughter Valerie is 22 years old. She is a recent graduate of Truman. She is living in the area. She's actually living in my basement. And I love it. I love it, love it, love it. She has a full-time job. She is launching into life. And she has gotten on board with a task force of 18 to 26-year-olds who are meeting regularly to talk about what to do here in the church to draw this age group. Today, after this service, my daughter is going to be going with Winter for lunch, and they're going to talk. Between Winter and Elizabeth, they're setting up appointments with every one of these young adults. They want to get to know them personally. I suspect what they're going to talk about is, where are you at with school? Where are you at with work? Where are you at with your family? Where are you at with relationships? Where are you at with the church? Where are you at with God? What do you like about Manchester? What don't you like about Manchester? And these young adults are going to be honest, and they need to be. As a parent, I could not be more delighted. My daughter entered into this task force, this ministry, a little skeptical, questioning. That's their job at that age. But she also entered in with genuine curiosity and interest and desire and a willingness to work hard, depending on how this goes. And she is being met with an unconventional, risk-taking, compassionate response. And as a parent, I can't tell you what that means to me. What that tells me is that at Manchester United Methodist Church, there's hope. At Manchester United Methodist Church, we absolutely strive to be the church of Jesus Christ.